And next here on Radio Free UK, the 58th weekly Friday show, we link you through to an item from the Spiked Online podcast. Spiked are an online radical magazine, and they're currently running an Invoke Article 50 Now campaign, which we're obviously very interested in. This is a roundtable discussion they had, and as with all our items, you can click through to visit the original, and if you like the content, why not subscribe directly? So this is from Spiked Online.
Welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Tom Slater, Deputy Editor at Spiked, and today I'll be talking to Brendan O'Neill, Luke Gittos, Blair Spowett and Charlie Peters about why we must uphold the Brexit vote and invoke Article 50 now. It's only been 2 weeks since 17.4 million Britons voted to leave the European Union, and yet Brexit feels as far away now as it ever has. Government ministers continue to delay invoking Article 50, suggesting it could be months, even years before Britain's exit is initiated. That's why, this week, Spike launched Invoke Article 50 Now, a campaign demanding that the Brexit vote be respected and acted upon immediately. In this podcast, we lay out our stall for why it's time to ditch the dithering and uphold the democratic will. To kick things off, I'm joined now by Spiked editor Brendan O'Neill to talk about why the call to invoke Article 50 is a democratic cry of our times. So Brendan, this week we launched our Invoke Article 50 Now campaign. Why is it so essential, do you think, that we start the process now?
I think this is a really important campaign. I think invoking Article 50 is the great democratic cry of our time, because in the EU referendum vote, 17.5 million people voted out of the EU, the largest political mandate in British political history, and it's just been sat on. People are just waiting around, taking their time, saying, oh, maybe we'll do it in a year's time, maybe 2 years' time, or they're saying maybe it will never happen. Maybe it will be struck out by lawyers. Maybe we'll realise it's not very constitutional. Maybe we'll realise it's a bad idea or madness, as David Lammy said, and maybe we won't act on it at all. I cannot believe that we claim to live in a democracy and yet people are openly discussing the possibility of not acting on the largest mandate in British history. That to me is shocking and disturbing and alarming. So Spiked, as a kind of, radical publication that sees itself as springing from the Chartists and various other radical agitators for more freedom and more democracy, we take this very seriously indeed. We've been writing about the problem of the EU for our whole 15 years that we've been in existence. Over the past 3 months in particular, in the run-up to the referendum, we wrote a great deal about the importance of wriggling free of the EU and having greater democratic control here in Britain. And so now we are going to take very seriously the fact that it's not being acted on. And it's demonstrating our whole argument, which is that there are very few people in politics today who take democracy seriously. So this campaign is about saying, the people have spoken, you must act on it right now. Don't dilly-dally, don't delay, do what they say. Politicians are our servants and they must obey us.
And what do you make of the argument that waiting to trigger Article 50 is kind of savvy and tactical, that it will give us more time to get our house in order and to suss out the deal with Brussels? What do you make of that argument?
I don't buy that at all. I think that's a really lame argument. It's utterly unconvincing. And I think sometimes it's being made by people who've got the best intentions. People who are pro-Brexit are making that argument. And they genuinely seem to think that as part of the negotiating process, we should hold off from invoking Article 50 and see what we can get first without causing any more turmoil. I think they underestimate the extent to which very few politicians today are willing to take such a huge risk as leaving the EU. And that includes people on the Leave side. I'm now utterly convinced, and I have been since the result came out, that even leavers of the Lead campaign, the official Leave campaign, are as horrified by the mass sentiment they have unleashed as people on the Remain side are. I don't believe for one moment that people like Boris Johnson and others are hugely in connection with ordinary people or are happy about the fact that they have tapped into this kind of quite radical anti-political class sentiment, I think they are also probably quite frightened of that as well. So I don't believe that even that side of the campaign are really particularly interested in making this kind of radical break with an institution that has been embroiled in British politics for 40 odd years. So I think the argument that we should wait and bide our time and see what we can get first is driven by caution and risk aversion and a fear of the public that is not that dissimilar to what we're seeing from the Remain side. I think it's also just wrong. The idea that by not triggering Article 50 we will strengthen our position in the negotiation process just seems to me to be a fantasy and factually incorrect. Because what it does, it sends a message of nervousness. It says that you are not willing to be decisive, you're not willing to make a firm stand, you're not willing to say, this is what we have decided and this is what we're going to do, now let's make a deal. And that, I think, boosts the other side. It sends the message to the other side, the anti-Brexit side, which is the whole of Brussels. It gives them extra power. It makes them feel that they can renegotiate in such a way that perhaps Britain won't be totally unravelled from the EU. So I think the longer we delay triggering Article 50, the more likely it is that the negotiating process will give rise to Brexit light or simply a tweaked version of the status quo. And that would also be anti-democratic in that it wouldn't be realising the thing that the people have demanded.
So what about the issue of parliamentary sovereignty in all this, which seems to be a concept that Remain voters have suddenly become very enamoured with? A lot of people who are looking to overturn or at least subvert the referendum result are very fond of pointing out that we do live in a parliamentary democracy, and us triggering Article 50 as a kind of executive action, doing it right away, would in a sense be anti-democratic. What do you make of that claim?
I think it's hilarious and shameless that they would make this argument because, you know, the whole argument that people like us have been making for the past 20 odd years against the EU is precisely that it dilutes parliamentary sovereignty, precisely that it creates an institution, the European Commission primarily, which by virtue of the fact that it can write directives and laws that impact on all the 500 million citizens of the EU, that means it overrides parliamentary sovereignty. That's the argument we've been making. So we take parliamentary sovereignty very seriously. Parliamentary sovereignty is a very good thing. We cut off a king's head for parliamentary sovereignty. We had wars for it. We fought tooth and nail over a long period of time to ensure that Parliament was the sovereign thing in the political realm. That's very important. But when Remainers now say, well, we're just respecting parliamentary sovereignty, so they must have the final decision on Brexit, it's a deeply cynical, deeply disingenuous argument, because these are not people, as their support for the EU shows, these are not people who are really interested in parliamentary sovereignty. They're only interested in it now because they think it can be a tool wielded against the people. They think it can be something that can be used to undermine the people's vote and what a huge majority of people have said they wanted. So they are perfectly happy for parliamentary sovereignty to be written off in the name of boosting the authority of bureaucrats in Brussels. But when it comes to ordinary people having their say, suddenly they want parliamentary sovereignty to rediscover its sense of purpose and strength and to shoot down the public, which is terrible and cynical and hypocritical. But even worse, it's undermining the very thing from which parliamentary sovereignty derives its legitimacy, which is the people, the public. If parliamentary sovereignty is to have any real moral meaning, it must be to represent what the public wants. And so I think this attempt to turn Parliament against the people is a really terrible thing to do. Of course, Parliament is sovereign, but it has a moral duty to do what the people want.
There's been this profound kind of lull post-Brexit after the first few days of everyone kind of running around like headless chickens. It's kind of settled back into Westminster politics, into Tory leadership chatter, and Brexit really feels as far away as ever. If we don't remain vigilant, do you think there's a very good chance that this will just never happen? It will just get lost amid all the kind of narrow politics we've been used to for so long?
Definitely. I think there's a very distinct possibility now that Brexit won't happen, kicked so far into the long grass that it will just become a memory. Or, as I was saying, that we might get a version of it that's not the real thing, that it's not really a proper Brexit. So that's a very real possibility, which is what makes our campaign, Invoke Article 50 now, so important. This is a serious campaign. We are saying you must act on it now, before it's forgotten, before it fizzles out, before it's subverted by people who do not like democracy. We've got to act on it. So that's a possibility. And I'm very interested in the fact that politics is starting to kind of sink back into its normal, everyday, slightly boring process. Because the great thing, to my mind, about Brexit and the vote is that it unfroze politics. The whole point of the EU was really to act as a lid on political conflict and unresolved political questions, in relation to German power, in relation to power relations across Europe, in relation to class relations, sovereignty, democracy, all these questions which were the questions of modern politics for 200 years. The whole role of the EU, the whole point of elevating technocracy above democracy was to bury those questions. No one really wanted to confront them, far less answer them. So the EU and the growth of technocracy more broadly has been an attempt to shove those questions aside. The great thing about the Brexit vote and the people saying we don't like the EU and we think there's an alternative, we think there's a different way of doing politics, is that it unleashed those questions. It reminded us that they have not been satisfactorily answered. It reminded us that questions of class and democracy and sovereignty in Britain remain pressing questions, unresolved questions, history bubbling under the surface, desperately trying to poke its head up and interrupt our nice, polite lives. That's what happened. So I'm very worried at all the attempts to push that underground, to bury it, to ignore it all over again. I think that would be another undermining of democracy, because the Brexit vote was a demand, firstly, that we leave the EU, and therefore we must do that and invoke Article 50 now. And it was also really a demand that there is something else to politics. There's another way of doing things. There is an alternative. That is what people were saying. And so if we don't also follow up on that, and we just go back into Westminster business as usual, then again we are failing what the people want.
And so where from here, how can we set about making sure that the Brexit vote isn't just buried and that we do make sure that the democratic will is respected?
I think we've got to really put pressure on politicians in the short term to act on the vote, to make sure that it becomes a reality. And then in the medium and the long term, we've got to just keep putting pressure on them to take the people seriously and to take public sentiment seriously and to engage with us on serious, big, meaningful issues. This was another good thing about the EU referendum. For the first time in years, we were being asked a serious question that had global implications. We seized that opportunity and we gave quite a radical answer to that question. But in most general elections and local elections and European elections, which of course very few people engage in, we're not asked questions like that. We are given small fry issues to talk about, or meaningless, pointless, local authority style issues, nothing of real historic substance. So I think they must act on what we said, which is we want to leave the EU, and they must start to give us proper, serious political questions to mull over and to think about and to have a say on. So this is a real opportunity, I think, to put pressure on politicians to do what we want and to elevate politics into a higher realm. And what Spike plans to do with our campaign, Invoke Article 50 now, and with our writing on the website and various other things that we're doing, we want to make the argument for democracy more urgent. We also want to deepen it. We want to historicise it a bit. We want to remind people of all the sacrifices that earlier radicals and earlier generations made for the democratic right to have a say in politics. And we want to re-energise the radical argument for freedom and democracy and for people's right to control the political system that they live under. That is a good, progressive, radical demand, and it's as pressing now as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago. And that's what Spiked plans to do.
That was Brendan O'Neill. Now let's turn to the legal attempts to scupper the Brexit vote. This week, the law firm Mishcon de Reya announced that it was looking into mounting a legal challenge against the government triggering Article 50 without a vote in Parliament. Working on behalf of unnamed business interests, the firm is arguing that initiating Brexit immediately would be unconstitutional. But for us at Spiked, this struck us as a bold attempt to subvert the democratic will, with our Article 50 Now campaign picketing the London offices of Mishcon de Reya on Thursday. To discuss more about the legal challenges to Brexit and what we can do to resist them, I'm joined now by Spike's law editor, Luke Gittos. So Luke, could you tell us a little bit about these legal challenges and the sort of arguments that are being made in favour of them?
So the London law firm Mishcon de Reya have indicated that they intend to bring proceedings to challenge the legality of not the Brexit vote, but the way in which the Brexit vote will be implemented. So this followed basically a number of articles by some quite high-profile constitutional lawyers about why they thought that the Brexit vote would need to be implemented through a parliamentary vote rather than use of the prerogative. The royal prerogative are a set of powers reserved to the government that used to be vested in the king or queen and are now exercised by usually the prime minister. And they're powers that allow the government to do things without having to have a vote in Parliament. So the issue that's been identified by Mishcon de Reya and other lawyers around them is that the invocation of Article 50 would effectively nullify or rid of effect a number of pieces of primary legislation, most obviously the European Communities Act. Lots of people have come out and said legally that's not right, that the prerogative can be used to invoke Article 50. So that's the real question, is whether or not this can be done by the Prime Minister sort of now, or whether he would have to table legislation, have a vote in Parliament, and put it to a vote. But the reason why this case matters is that the people who are bringing this claim haven't been named yet, but we know they are a network of businesses, one of which we think is Zoopla, who have voiced their concerns about the referendum result. Everyone around this case knows that it is being brought in order to give Remainers a sort of second throw of the dice. So while on the one hand there is this kind of sensible legal point that needs to be worked out, we probably should do this the correct way, and you wouldn't want to invoke Article 50 in an illegal way, it's very clear that this case is being brought for the sake of holding up and eventually preventing Brexit, which clearly makes it anti-democratic.
And so in terms of the arguments themselves, do they have much merit? Do these arguments on their own terms even stack up, do you think?
The problem is nobody knows. It has genuinely split legal expert opinion. So on the one hand, you have people like Lord Pannick, very eminent constitutional lawyer, arguing that this point does have merit. And on the other hand, you have a whole host of QCs and silks arguing that it doesn't. The problem is that Article 50 says we have to withdraw within our constitutional requirements. And because we have an unwritten constitution, no one really knows what those constitutional requirements are. What this really speaks to is the fact that no one thought about this before the referendum. So now we're in a very awkward position where it takes up the form of a legal challenge. We have this unfortunate picture of a London law firm backed by a group of wealthy businessmen seeking to overthrow the will of 17 million people, when in fact this question should, of course, have been resolved prior to the referendum ever taking place.
Now, one of the interesting arguments to come out of all of this is that really this is in the name of maintaining parliamentary sovereignty, that in effect by triggering Article 50 through royal prerogative, they would be overriding the sovereignty of Parliament by preventing them from voting on this legislation. What do you make of that argument?
I think it's a complete red herring, really. Whether we invoke it through Parliament or through royal prerogative really is only of academic interest. It really shouldn't make a blind bit of difference which route you take, because the end result, considering the result of the referendum, has to be the same in order for this to be a democratic decision, right? It has to either be invoked through prerogative or through Parliament. If it goes through Parliament, then any MP who campaigned to remain must now obey the will of the people, because it's the will of the people that sits even above the sovereignty of Parliament. And the idea that MPs should allow what they see to be their constituency obligations to override the biggest historical mandate in electoral history. 17 million people have never voted for something in the same way before. The idea that they would then say, well, I've got to represent my constituents and I can ignore the fact that the entire country has voted for something, I think would be a very cheap way of avoiding the most direct expression of democratic will that we've seen ever.
And of course, these legal kind of skirmishes aren't happening in a vacuum. I mean, what do you think this speaks to about the kind of general post-Brexit climate, which seems to have been defined by a lot of attempts to scupper it, essentially?
Well, of course, this case fits into a context, and the context is a whole group of people seeking to challenge, override, fudge the referendum vote. You know, we saw the March on Parliament where 20,000 people showed up to overthrow the result. I was there. There was calls to overthrow the vote, to do anything we can to prevent Brexit, to, you know, all sorts of arguments about how people was misled into this decision. Then you have politicians doing exactly the same thing. The Labour MP David Lammy tweeted almost immediately after the result happened that this was madness and we need to act as politicians in order to prevent the result of the referendum being enacted. And almost every political commentator who was on the Remain side has come out since with some way that they think Brexit can be prevented. So that really reflects the kind of elite climate around this. You have a whole network of people completely closing ranks. But the point is that the British public were given a question. The government put out leaflets to them with paragraphs saying the government will implement your decision. Make sure you take this seriously. They did take it seriously. They gave an answer. Now, for the government and the Remain crowd to turn around and say that somehow this vote is inaccurate or invalid, I think shows a real cheapening of the idea of democracy and actually a real bastardisation, a real manipulation of it to suit people's ends. And I think that's very dangerous.
So finally, on these legal challenges, it seems to have taken the entire kind of debate outside of democratic discussion full stop. It's been conducted, entirely on the kind of legal blogosphere. So how do we remain vigilant against those challenges?
I think we need to keep reminding those people that are singing the virtues of this Mishcon de Reya case that this is taking place in a context. We can't allow them to ignore the fact that this case is being brought in a climate which is severely geared towards attempting to override the result of a democratic vote. The climate is such that it's patently clear that a certain group of people don't want this vote to have any impact. And we need to keep pointing out to people who pretend that this case is some kind of democratic service to the country, that it's actually a blow, an attempted blow against the popular will. I think in terms of going forward, what we need to argue for is that, one, the result of this case should be academic. We want Article 50 invoked now. We don't care how you do it. It has to be done now, because that's what the people have said. Either it goes through Parliament, in which case all politicians have to vote to either pass the Act or abstain. There must be a parliamentary majority in favour of passing Brexit. Alternatively, the Prime Minister should run with what he promised in the lead up to the referendum, stick by his word, activate the royal prerogative, and live with the consequences of your decision to have the referendum in the first place.
That was Luke Gittos. Now, back to the campaign. Invoke Article 50 now got off to a flying start this week, launching online, gathering support, stirring up conversation, and culminating in a picket outside the offices of Mishcon de Reya in central London. To talk more about the campaign, how to get involved, and what's happening next, I'm joined now by campaign organisers Blair Spowett and Charlie Peters. So Blair, tell us a little bit about the campaign.
So Invoke Article 50 now is a new campaign to invoke Article 50, which is the legal process by which the UK leaves the European Union. The Leave vote was the biggest mandate in British political history, but since the referendum, we've seen forces in politics, in the media, all trying to, in various ways, undermine the result of the vote. And the longer we leave it, the more likely it is that it will be undermined, the more opportunity they'll have to do that. So we want it invoked not, as Theresa May has said, by next year, but as soon as possible. But more profoundly, I think a broader aim of the campaign needs to be to defend the democratic ideal itself. If the reaction to the referendum tells us anything, it's that ideal is under severe threat. So the campaign, the broader aim of the campaign is to try and inject British politics with a greater respect for democracy.
And so, Charlie, the campaign held its first picket this week. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, as Blair was just saying, there are various forces trying to reduce the power of the biggest democratic mandate in British political history. And another force here is Mishcon de Reya, who are announcing a plan possibly to present a legal challenge to the Brexit vote by diverting it via Parliament. Now, Parliament, as an institution, doesn't actually agree with the voice of the people. They voted to leave, and most MPs would vote to remain. So we went to their offices in Holborn to stand outside and to let them know that we don't accept their motive, we don't accept their plans to distract from democracy, and that they should get off it.
And so, Blair, why should people get involved in this campaign? What do you think is at stake here?
Well, first of all, I think invoking Article 50 now is so important because on a practical level, we need to show Europe that we're serious about leaving the EU. There are a few politicians, both in the EU and in national governments across Europe, who still think that Britain isn't going to leave the EU. The Austrian finance minister came out and said as much quite recently. And if that's the way they're thinking, then when it comes to negotiations, they might end up bluffing because they think that we're not going to leave, so they'll give us a rubbish deal. But, on a more principled point, this was a great democratic moment for Britain. And if we end up not leaving the EU and Article 50 isn't invoked, or it's put off, then millions of people will have been told that their vote didn't make a difference and that their vote doesn't matter. We hear so much from politicians about trying to get ordinary people involved in politics, and now what we're seeing is an attempt to shut them out. So that's why it's important.
So, Charlie, what's next for the campaign? We've got an event today. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the Remain supporters in London are having a picnic against Brexit in Green Park in London today. And we're going to go along and sort out our own picnic for democracy in response to their own thing. It's like a counter picnic, I suppose. And whilst we're there, we're hoping to speak to people, understand why they oppose the vote and why they don't want us to leave the European Union, even after we've so emphatically voted to do so.
You've been listening to the Spiked podcast. To find out how you can get involved in our Invoke Article 50 Now campaign, head over to spiked-online.com. Check out our campaign Facebook page, facebook.com/Invoke Article 50 Now, and follow us on Twitter @SpikedOnline. Thanks for listening.